Protesters stand their ground in Peru. Despite a state of emergency and at least 25 killed, supporters of former President Pedro Castillo demand his release and the resignation of his successor. Can Dina Boluarte bring stability, or should Peru prepare for even more political turmoil? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the crisis in Peru. Many have described it as chaos in Peru, with protests and political instability leaving the future of the country entirely unclear. After the first left-wing president in decades took office last year, his supporters say Peru's right-wing Congress has been determined to get him out. Well, eventually they succeeded. And right now, Pedro Castillo sits in jail after a reportedly failed attempt to reach the Mexican embassy to apply for asylum. A controversial state of emergency is now in effect, with Castillo's former vice president and former ally now in charge. Here's a look at the case against Castillo and how Peru got to this point.
Protests have rocked the Andean state of Peru for weeks. The government declared a state of emergency, but protesters continue to blockade highways, set buildings on fire, and invade airports. The unrest left hundreds of tourists stranded and 25 people dead.
The police surrounded us and sprayed pepper spray at us. I narrowly escaped. They suffocated us. All we want is for the voice of the people to be heard.
Peruvians are calling for the resignation of President Dina Boluarte. In an effort to restore calm, she is pushing for early elections.
I am only fulfilling the constitutional mandate. There is a group saying, Dina, step down, but what will be solved by my quitting? Is the problem solved? The problem won't be solved. We will be firm until Congress agrees to bring forward elections.
The turmoil began with the ousting of Peru's first indigenous president, Pedro Castillo. On December 7th, Castillo tried to dissolve the Congress to avoid a third impeachment vote against him. Hours later, Congress voted to remove him from power. From a jail cell where he is serving 18 months pre-trial detention, Castillo insists he is still the lawful president. He denies charges of conspiracy and rebellion. Furious at a political system they deemed to be run by the elite, his supporters took to the streets, demanding his freedom.
We are here supporting President Pedro Castillo, who is now in prison because of discrimination, because they don't want an Andean to govern the Congress, and it's an abuse.
Pedro Castillo's presidency was rocky from the start. The former school teacher had little experience in politics before narrowly winning the 2021 elections, boosted by rural and indigenous voters. His brief time in office was tumultuous. His cabinet had a high turnover, churning through 5 prime ministers in just 17 months. And he has faced multiple corruption allegations, which he says were part of a political persecution.
It's totally unfair. I hope the Peruvian people will rise and defend the popular vote. We elected him. The Peruvian people elected him. The Congress did not let him work. All Peruvians are aware of this. The Congress of the Republic never allowed President Pedro Castillo work.
After his ousting, his vice president Dina Boluarte was sworn in. She is the first woman to be president of Peru, but calls for her resignation have overshadowed her leadership. Peru is no stranger to political upheaval, but with discontent growing, President Boluarte is unlikely to be given the space or time to unite the country. With the smoke of fires and tear gas hanging in the city streets and the death toll rising, she must find a way to douse the flames, and quickly.
Now, Peru was already facing massive social challenges, including pervasive inequality and the highest rate of food insecurity on the continent. It's a time Lima can least afford this level of instability, yet here we are. So, can Peru find a way out of this crisis? Joining me now to debate that are, from Lima, Hugo De Zela. He is Peru's former ambassador to the United States and the former vice minister of foreign affairs. In Managua, Nicaragua, is Ben Norton, a journalist and the founder of the Multipolarista news portal. And from Miami, Eduardo Gamarra, he's a professor of politics and international relations at Florida International University. Thanks all so much for being with me. Let's first try to establish kind of where everyone stands here. Hugo De Zela, I'll start with you. You believe Castillo is really to blame for his own demise because he spent his energy fighting with Congress rather than focusing on policy. But you know his supporters say he really had no choice because Congress simply would not let him work, much less succeed, because the political elites want power back at whatever cost. Is there any truth to that?
Well, obviously there is some truth about it, but I wouldn't say that that's the whole explanation. Castillo is out because he did try to make a coup d'etat. The question is, they are now trying to develop a story in which he is only the victim, when in reality, he did try to make a coup d'etat, and that is something wrong in every democratic country. And because of that, he was ousted by the Congress, and because of that, because that's a violation of the Peruvian Constitution, he's now in jail.
Okay, Ben, is it that simple? Was it Castillo's attempt at a coup, and was it just unconstitutional and he no longer deserves to be in office?
Well, we have to understand this in the context of the region of Latin America. This is not the first time a leader that was democratically elected has been overthrown in what you could call a parliamentary coup. This is a tactic that has become more and more common. We saw it against the elected President Fernando Lugo of Paraguay in 2012. We saw it against President Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016. And there are many parallels to the overthrow of Bolivia's President Evo Morales in 2019. This is a new kind of coup, and that's why many leaders in the region are denouncing it as such. In fact, the new elected president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, just gave a speech, an interview in which he said it was a parliamentary coup. We've seen that the governments of Mexico and Bolivia and Honduras and many other governments in the region have been denouncing it as a coup because they see parallels to what's been going on in the region for many decades now, where oligarchic forces that can't win elections at the ballot box will use other means to attack elected politicians, including judicial warfare known as lawfare, and including parliamentary coups like this.
Ben, you have to explain the terminology you just used. You called them oligarchic forces. And what does that equate to, especially in Peruvian politics? I think we've been describing it more simply as the political elite, but it is actually a lot more complex than that, is it not?
Well, it's no surprise that many countries on Earth are very unequal, and including, in the global North as well. But especially in the case of Peru, this is a deeply unequal country, along with countries in Latin America that have deep economic inequality, and their political systems tend to be dominated by a small handful of powerful economic interests. You could call them oligarchs. In the case of Peru, this is very clear, where the majority of the population is of indigenous descent. And yet the only president they've really ever had in modern Peruvian history that is of indigenous descent is Pedro Castillo, who served just around 17 months in office. I mean, it's no secret that in Peru, the political system is deeply dysfunctional and deeply undemocratic. That's why there have been 7 presidents in 6 years.
Okay, Eduardo, I saw you kind of not nod your head, kind of put your head down. I don't know what you were thinking there, but if you could explain.
Well, it's interesting to listen to my two colleagues, and I think the ambassador is probably a little bit closer to what I would consider to be an adequate explanation of what's happened in Peru. But I think at the same time, as you pointed out, maybe it's too simple to simply say that there was an attempted coup by the former president now, Castillo. I think Peru is really deeply mired in what I would call a structural crisis that isn't recent. This is a crisis that goes back at least 2 decades. And it has to do in some measure with things maybe as simple as the kinds of constitutional arrangements that Peru has. Peru has sort of a hybrid regime, kind of a mixture between parliamentarism and presidentialism. In the context of the explosion of political parties, Peru has 25 political parties at last count. Maybe the ambassador can tell us that there may be a few less or a few more, but 25 political parties in any system is way too many. Secondly, you have the collapse of traditional political parties, and therefore you have an enormous crisis of representation. And while you have an atomized political system, you have a deeply polarized country. In fact, as Ben was saying, Peru is one of the most unequal countries in the hemisphere. And polarization is not just between the upper and the lower classes. I think that's too simple. There's ethnic conflict, there's regional conflict. And so these are very complex societies trying to be governed by a political class that is not just simply, again, it's very, very simple to say the oligarchy versus the good people, right? I mean, Peru's political system, in fact, is probably one of the ones that has had the most, let's call it, reversal of fortune by the oligarchy. It's very hard to say what oligarchy Ben is referring to. Fujimorismo came in the 1990s and stayed in and reformed the country. And Fujimorismo is still a very significant populist political force in Peru. At the same time, you have political parties that don't represent anybody, right? These are, in the Andes, we call them taxi parties because they're parties that are so small they can hold their convention inside of a taxi cab. So when you have, you know, in the case of President Castillo, he had 17 members in Congress of over 130 members, impossible to govern.
Yeah.
So we need to look at it more from a structural point of view.
Yeah, I mean, it does. The structure you're describing does sound like a formula for chaos in a sense. But Ben, I mean, is there also an element here of Peruvians just expecting too much from a man with no solid political experience to deliver against this political elite or this kind of oligarchy, as you've described, that's always just kind of held people like him back and kept them out of politics anyway from the beginning? They don't have men like Pedro Castillo. They don't have the kind of political experience that would allow them to effectively do the job.
Well, that's exactly the point. And I do agree that it's a structural crisis. This is a structural crisis largely due to the legacy of Fujimorismo in the 1990s, when there really was an actual dictatorship in Peru. And let's not forget that Fujimori committed genocide against the indigenous population. We know that under the name of so-called family planning, 300,000 indigenous people were sterilized. And for shame, USAID actually helped to fund that program. That's the US government. So that legacy very, very much lives in the minds of Peruvians, especially those of indigenous descent today. When I talk about the oligarchy, I don't only mean the people, you know, outside of politics who have significant economic influence. I'm talking about even recent presidents like Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, who is a multimillionaire. He worked in the United States in investment banking in the World Bank for many decades. He had U.S. citizenship until he renounced his citizenship in 2015 to run for president of Peru. I mean, we're talking about a country where the indigenous descent majority, working class majority, has not had political representation. Who is Pedro Castillo? Why did he become famous? He is a teacher in a rural area. He's a farmer. He led a teacher strike and he became a national figure. That's why we see so many people in Peru protesting right now, despite the fact that many people on the Peruvian left, in fact, had criticisms of Castillo. They said that he didn't go far enough. He gave in too much to the opposition. But we see so many people protesting in the streets of Peru because it was the only time for just 17 months that they had a government that at least tried to act on behalf of the interest of the majority of the population and not a small minority elite.
Okay. Hugo De Zela, I can see you disagree. I mean, and let's be fair. I think it needs to be said that we know Castillo is unpopular now in Peru, but Congress is even less popular.
Well, almost nobody who is in politics in Peru is popular. You are completely right in that. But I think it's a complete distortion of the Peruvian history to say that Castillo was the first president of that characteristics. Let me give you 4 examples to show this in the Peruvian history. One example is from several years ago, President Sánchez Cerro, who is of the same origin. Another example is President Toledo, who used to shoe shine as a kid, so you cannot say he comes from the oligarchy. Then President Humala, who used to be a soldier, President Velasco, who's also somebody from the same origin. So you cannot say, as happily as Ben said, that this is the first Peruvian president who has a humble origin. That has happened all the time in Peru. This myth about the oligarchy governing the country is simply not true.
Okay, it's interesting, though, that you say this, Ambassador, because it's not just Ben. I mean, this is all over the media, that this is Peru's first working-class president in decades, that his story is truly remarkable because of the roots he came from. I mean, is that a complete false narrative, then, that's been perpetrated really globally now?
No, well, the question is that's only true on the surface, but that's not the whole truth. As Professor Gamarra was explaining, we have here in my country a very complex situation. It's not the good versus the bad only. There are good people on both sides, and there are bad people also. But the question is, this is a political situation in which, because we have no political parties, because we have a weakened political system, because we have no credibility for the political persons, we have no real leadership. And then we are entering into what people call an ochlocracy, which is the government by the mob. And that's something we cannot allow. I think something that has not been said in the media is that the Peruvian institutions worked pretty well in this situation, because the Congress did what they have to do, the judiciary did the same, the military respected the democratic order, so institutions are working in my country.
Okay, Ben, I can see you smirking a bit. It's kind of a situation that, you know, bad is the best they can do from a little bit of what's being described. But Eduardo, I need to come back to you and look at some of the more immediate issues. And when we do look at the immediate problems that Peruvians are dealing with, the high cost of basic supplies, including fuel, of course, brought people onto the streets even before this crisis started. Were those conditions a symptom of just global inflation and the global economy, some say, falling apart, or is it specifically about a failure of leadership in Peru?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. Certainly what's going on in the world economy is having a direct impact on Peru. But the mismanagement that has been really the case in Peru, not just under President Castillo, but under previous presidents as well, is probably at the core of what's happening. The mismanagement of the entire COVID crisis, for example, right? That, in fact, precipitated previous confrontations between former presidents and Parliament. See, this is one of the things that's so striking about Peru, that Parliament has the right to revoke mandates, but so too do presidents have the right, or at least the perceived right, to close Congress down. That's why I refer to this kind of hybrid system with a kind of parliamentary logic to it. That only exacerbates the crisis. The other thing, which is very important, and it's the fact that President Castillo was accused, and with some real evidence, of enormous acts of corruption, including members of his own family. So Congress tried on repeated occasions over the last 18 months to bring the president to account in Congress. And so, this only it's almost kind of like becoming a permanent characteristic of Peruvian politics. Since President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski that Ben referred to, until the present, every single president has been accused of corruption. Let's not remember that a former president who governed twice, committed suicide because of accusations of corruption against him. That President Toledo is in California awaiting extradition to the United States, accused of corruption. That President Humala and his wife were also accused of corruption.
Right.
So there's maybe an endemic thing here that leads to this ungovernability of Peru. And as the ambassador says, unless Peruvians can somehow find a formula, to find leadership that can overcome this particular moment, the most likely scenario is an indefinite continuation of this crisis.
And that is tragic. I mean, Ben, going back to what the ambassador was saying, he believes Peru is doing actually the best it can, and in spite of this political turmoil, the institutions of the country still somehow work. So now we are where we are, but we have Castillo's supporters protesting against Dina Boluarte, who used to be his vice president. There seems to be very little faith in her for some reason, even though at the grassroots level, she should stand for what Castillo's voters actually wanted in the first place. So, it makes me feel like they're just, with what we have at present, there's not a lot of hope for this to find any sense of stability in Peru.
Not at all. With all due respect, I don't know how anyone with a straight face could say the institutions are working well in Peru. 25 protesters, at least, have been killed in the past 2 weeks since the ouster of Castillo. And we see that hundreds have been injured. We see that civil society organizations' offices and political parties' offices are being raided by the police, including the left-wing party of Verónica Mendoza, Nuevo Peru. Also, the Peruvian Federation of Campesinos, of Peasants, their office was also raided by the police and people were detained. I mean, we're seeing mass violence in the streets. We're seeing horrifying videos of military officers on the streets, heavily armed. In fact, the Peruvian human rights watchdog even reported that military and police are using helicopters to shoot at protesters and drop tear gas bombs on them. So I don't know how anyone could say that the institutions are working well. The reason there are so many protests in Peru right now is because the institutions have failed, especially the Constitution. And we should be clear that, yes, many of the people in the streets do support Castillo, but they're not saying that Castillo should be president again. They have three very clear demands. They're saying that Pedro Castillo should be released from prison. He's been sentenced to 16 months in preventative prison without real due process, without a real trial. That's one of their first demands. Their second demand is new elections as soon as possible. And the other demand, which I think is the most important, if you listen to what protesters are saying, is a constituent assembly to write a new constitution. Because the reason there have been 7 presidents in 6 years is because Article 113 of the Fujimorista Constitution, written by the Fujimori dictatorship, gives the unicameral Congress the ability to remove a democratically elected president with 2/3 majority vote if they declare the president to be so-called morally incapable. Of course, that term is very ambiguous. So what that really means is if the Congress can get a majority, including through bribery, as in the infamous Mamani Video scandal, where we know that right-wing members of the Fujimorista party, Fuerza Popular, led by the former dictator's daughter, Keiko Fujimori, were bribing politicians to go along with their voting against or for presidential vacancy, which means overthrowing the president. We know there's a historical precedent here of Congress members bribing other members to vote for or against the president. It's impossible to have a democratic government if you have that clause in the Constitution that makes it basically a poison pill and impossible for a president to govern. That's why the people of Peru are out demanding a new constitution.
Eduardo, you have a look of exhaustion. I mean, I just have to ask you then, because I mean, the demands of the protesters actually sound realistic. Most people would agree this 18 months pre-trial detention for Castillo is a bit over the top, to say the least. But this demand for an election, I just have to end with this. If it comes forth, what would it even produce? Is there a new generation of politicians somehow waiting in the wings that can magically solve these problems, or are you just producing the same thing?
I think what the ambassador was saying at the beginning is really the problem, that there doesn't appear to be any reasonable political force that might even, be able to preside over this process. Calling for elections immediately, in fact, may be the solution. But given the 25 political forces that are there, given the kind of electoral structure that you have, no matter what kind of elections you have, you're also going to produce a parliament similar to the one that you currently have. You're going to have an extraordinarily atomized party. I remember when President Kuczynski was in office, for example, he also had only 17 members in Congress and couldn't muster, even a single bill through Congress. That's the kind of Congress that would be elected if you convoked elections right now. So can you convoke a constituent assembly, as Ben suggests, and which has been sort of the favorite call? In fact, that was one of the calls that President Castillo launched after his coup. But I think it's a very difficult thing to say elections will solve everything right now.
Eduardo, and Ambassador, I apologize. I'd hope to come back to you, but we are unfortunately completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers, so that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter. Do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we will see you next time.